The Mill Owner's Daughter.
Chapter 16. December passed into January, and 1842 gave way to 1843. Before the Etherell household knew it, the cold, bitter winter had passed, and spring was on its way. It was the beginning of March, and by the middle of the month Irene Rose would be 8 months pregnant. Janet Morrison had undertaken a temporary job, assisting with the bookkeeping in Gibraltar Mill, and become very much involved in the preparations for the new producer co-op, backed by Matthew and Mary Upton. She and her children were now permanent guests of Matthew and the O'Donnells, and would remain so until after the trial. Young Daniel stayed with Irene Rose most evenings during the week, but always spent some time each day with his father, as well as Saturday evenings and Sundays. Faith, Benjamin and Constance continued to thrive, Constance proving to be a bundle of mischief on the one hand and a great entertainer of her siblings on the other. The adults had planned a low-key celebration for Christmas in view of the circumstances, but inevitably the children decided otherwise, took control and lifted the spirits of their elders in the process. The trial at Lancaster Spring Assizes was now taking place, with Janet in attendance along with Matthew Etherell. David Morrison's optimism had proved to be well-founded. Sir Robert Peel and his Tory government had had second thoughts. Instead of a show trial, they decided to play the events of the previous year down. The establishment press had written the general strike-off as the Plug Plot riots, portraying it as an episode of spontaneous madness on the part of the working classes, in effect fabricating history to meet the short-term needs of the establishment. The men now faced lesser charges, although the Attorney General still led the prosecution. "Gentlemen of the jury, I now leave my case in your hands. Whatever it may have been with t'others, it has been a wage question with me, and I dare say that if Mr. O'Connor has made it a Chartist question, he has done wonders to make it extend through England, Ireland and Scotland, but it was always a wage question and 10 hours bill with me." Richard Pilling glanced across the courtroom and fixed his eyes on the prosecutor, the Attorney General, as if daring him to contradict his assertion, before turning back to the jury. He drew himself up to his full height, standing erect. "I've advocated the keeping up of wages for a long time, and I shall do so till the end of me days, and if confined within the walls of a dungeon, knowing that as an individual I've done my duty, knowing that I've been one of the great spokes in the wheel by which that last reduction of wages were prevented, knowing that by means of that turnout thousands and tens of thousands have eaten the bread which they would not have eaten if the turnout hadn't taken place, I'm satisfied whatever may be the result," he informed them, more than a touch of defiance in his tone. "With these observations, I shall leave you to perform your duty. I've no doubt but you wilt, by your verdict, allow me to return to my loving wife and loving children, and to my employment. My master has told me, coming away, that if I return again he'll never take advantage of me as long as I'm a good workman. With these considerations I'll leave my case with you, hoping and trusting you'll no rely on the garbled statements given by the witnesses about the turnout, but on the honesty and sincerity of the individual afore you." He paused, glanced at the judge, his eyes shining bright, before winding his defence up. "And now, gentlemen of the jury, you have the case afore you. The maisters conspired to kill me, and I combined to keep me sound alive." Matthew turned to Janet. "A masterly defence. Richard's quite right. At the end of the day the strike was about wages, working hours and conditions. It was a strike against starvation. The Charter's important as a measure required to guarantee all those objectives in the long term, but it wasn't the purpose of the strike in itself." Janet nodded agreement, but the big question for her remained unanswered. What would the decision of the jury be? She took in the fine clothes of the 12 men, in whose hands the fate of the 59 accused now rested. The sight provided little room for comfort. All were middle class, and unlikely to allow facts or basic human sentiment, let alone simple justice, to influence their judgment. In this she was quite right. According to the court record, the foreman of the jury was James Anderton, Esquire, of Duxbury. The rest were Charles Armstrong of Everton, a merchant, Isaiah Ashley of Kirkdale, another merchant, James Rothwell Barnes, Esquire, of Great Lever, a gentleman, James Blythe, Plymouth Grove, Charlton upon Medlock, Manchester, gentleman, Edward Brooke of Rusholme, merchant, Thomas Edgley of Rusholme, merchant, Thomas Haig of Wavertree, merchant, Richard Harrison of Burnley, of no employment and presumably a retired gentleman, William Scott, another gentleman, Forsyth William Smythe of Toxteth Park, merchant, and Charles Storrs, a manager of Kennedy Brothers, Manchester. Edward Brooke, Thomas Edgley and James Blythe were all known to Matthew. The latter was a near neighbour of another friend, the author Elizabeth Gaskell, who also lived on Plymouth Grove in Charlton upon Medlock. Matthew thought he might be sympathetic to the workers' cause, as he knew Gaskell was. As for the rest, he didn't know their views and could only assume the worst. In this regard, neither he nor Janet were far wrong. After a trial lasting 8 days, the jury found Janet's husband guilty, as they did Frederick Augustus Taylor, James Arthur, Jonathan R.H. Bairstow, Robert Brooke, John Campbell, Thomas Cooper, George Candler, John Durham, Christopher Doyle, James Fenton, James Leach, John Leach, James Mooney, Bernard McCartney, William Aitken, John Aaron, William Beasley, Alexander Challenger, George Julian Harney, William Hill, editor of the Northern Star, John Hoyle, John Norman, Fergus O'Connor, Richard Otley, Samuel Parks, Thomas Railton, Robert Ramsden, James Skevington, and William Woodruff. Peter Murray MacDowell had been found guilty in his absence. He'd rather wisely taken a much-needed holiday in France with a few revolutionaries he happened to be acquainted with. Much to Janet's and Matthew's relief, Richard Pilling was found not guilty, as were Patrick Murphy Brophy, James Chippendale, Joseph Clark, John Crossley, Thomas Fraser, John Lomax, Thomas Mahone, David Ross, Albert Wolfenden, Thomas Storer, William Booth, John Fletcher, James Graspy, John Massey, the Reverend Schofield, William Stevenson, James Taylor, and Thomas Brown Smith. The rest of the accused, John Atkinson, James Cartledge, George Johnson, William Schofield, John Thornton, John Wilde, and Thomas Pitt, were acquitted by consent of the jury. Although the death penalty had been ruled out as a result of lesser charges being brought against the men, those found guilty still faced long prison sentences or transportation. The trials of those from the Potteries in Staffordshire generally provided no comfort at all in this regard. 54 men in total had been sentenced to transportation to Australia, 3 for 7 years, 18 for 10 years, 9 for 15 years, 13 for 21 years, and 11 for life. Janet and Matthew returned to Manchester the day after the trial, with those found not guilty, Janet having been refused permission to see David, who, like the rest found guilty, now awaited sentencing. On the return journey, she seemed to remain calm. She spent most of the time on the train in conversation with Richard Pilling and Patrick Murphy Brophy. At one point, somebody had asked Richard how he felt. He'd replied, "Well, I'm no dead and I'm no in jail, so I mun be half free, I guess." Janet had joined in the general merriment, but Matthew knew deep down she must be hurting badly, devastated by the prospect of being separated from David, the husband and father of her children she loved so much. The best she could hope for now was that her husband be sentenced to transportation to Australia. At least she could follow him with the children, and hopefully they could build a new life together.